Part 3. School's Out. 36. "Jen, turn one of the cots over," said Robert, kneeling beside the injured, possibly dead kid. First things first. He reached for the weapon, half expecting the teenager's hand to close over it at any second. It didn't. The barrel of the gun was still warm. Robert tucked it gingerly into the waistband of his jeans, then checked for a pulse. It was strong and regular. Next, he leaned over to inspect the wound on the side of the stranger's neck. On closer examination, he realized it had been made by a bullet. The deep furrow was about an inch long and looked like it had missed anything vital. It was still bleeding, but not badly. "Pass me that towel, Jen." Normally, Jen would have scolded him for not saying please, but in the circumstances, she barely noticed. She handed him the one threadbare towel their captors had allowed them, and he bunched it up before pressing it to the open wound. "Let's put him on the cot." "He's so heavy," said Jennifer, struggling to hold up the stranger's legs. When they finally placed him on it, she covered him with a blanket and looked at Robert. "What now?" "I guess we see if we can find a first aid kit. His pulse is strong, so maybe he's just passed out from shock or something." "What about the guards?" "To be honest, if they let him get this far without coming for him, I don't think there are any left. You stay here. I'll go and look." "No way. We're sticking together." Robert opened his mouth to argue, but closed it just as quickly when he saw the determination on her face. He nodded. "Come on, then." Robert took the pistol out. Jen's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. Robert had no experience with guns, not even to check if it was still loaded, but certainly knew how to pull a trigger. He just hoped it didn't have a safety or whatever they called those things you had to click to shoot. If they ran across someone hostile, he would just have to squeeze the trigger and hope for the best. In the corridor, Robert was careful to keep Jen behind him. They slowly crept along the wall. In the distance, where the hallway opened into the foyer of the main building, Robert spied the broken body of a Chinese soldier. He didn't try to protect his cousin from the gory sight. They had both seen enough death and violence recently to have become hardened to it. The foyer was a mess. Bullet holes, splintered wood, blood. That was nothing compared to the carnage they could see through the doors to the 2 rooms their captors had used as their own. At the door to the reception, Robert looked around. He wasn't concerned with the ordinary soldiers he saw lying in pools of their own blood. What he was interested in was the body of Senior Field Officer Chu. It was lying in the entrance to the building. He decided to check if she was really dead. The camp leader had been a cruel mistress. The now healed whip marks on his back from their first night proved that. With his heart beating fast and Jennifer gripping his arm just a little tighter, they approached. The cruel woman was on her back, with her eyes closed. She wore pants and boots, but only a bra besides. Her eyes were swollen, and there was a bloody gash across the bridge of her nose. It was bent at a nasty angle. "Is she alive?" whispered Jen. He didn't answer. There were no obvious wounds, but the woman's chest wasn't moving. Robert knew to be sure he had to check her pulse. He knelt beside her and cautiously reached out. His fingers touched her skin and her eyes snapped open. Robert scrambled back in fright as Jen shrieked in terror. Chu rolled over and got to her knees. With her hair disheveled and blood coating her nose, mouth, and chin, she looked for all the world like a character from a bad horror movie. Robert suddenly remembered he held a pistol and pointed it at her chest with a trembling hand as she struggled to her feet, pulling a hidden knife from her boot as she did. "Don't move!" She paid no heed to the gun, simply held up the knife and took another step. "Where is he? Tell me and I won't gut you like a fish." Robert and Jen took a step back. "Stop and drop the knife or I'll shoot," Robert threatened. Chu spat up a gob of blood on the floor and took another step forward. "Go on, then." Another step. "Shoot her, Robert." Robert pulled the trigger. Nothing. No click. No shot. Just a hard nothing. The woman laughed and raised her knife as she ran at him. 37. "Get down!" roared a voice from behind them. Robert, already in the process of moving to push Jen out of the way, tackled her to the floor just before the air above them was stitched by hot metal. The burst of shooting was short, and when it was done, Robert looked back at the camp leader. She was on her back, staring at the ceiling with glassy eyes as wisps of smoke coiled up from the wounds in her stomach and chest. Jen poked him in the shoulder, drawing his attention away from their dead captor and tormentor. Robert climbed to his feet and helped Jen up without taking their eyes off the now conscious kid who had just saved them. He was watching them warily as he swayed, holding the automatic weapon he'd picked up from the dead soldier in front of Chu's office. "Thanks," said Robert, opening the dialogue. The other guy nodded. "Sorry. I should have finished her before, but I heard you calling for help." He bent his knees to put the weapon on the floor and promptly fell to his backside. Jen rushed over to him before Robert could stop her. "Where's the towel? You need to be lying down." The stranger waved vaguely down the hall. "Robert, go get it, please, and water." Slightly put out at being ordered around by his younger cousin, Robert nevertheless did as he was asked. "My name's Jen," she was saying when he returned. "What's yours?" "Huh?" said Jack, pointing at his bleeding ear. "Sorry, I think my eardrum is busted." Jen leaned around to speak in his good ear. "I said my name's Jen. What's yours?" "Oh, it's Jack." Robert returned and handed Jen the towel. Her patient winced when she put the towel against his neck. Robert poured water from the pitcher he'd carried from their cell into a plastic cup and offered it to Jack. He took it and guzzled it down. "Thanks. It's Robert." "Thanks, Robert." Jack pointed at the discarded pistol on the floor between them and the body of Senior Field Officer Chu and smiled. "You know, those work better if you flick the safety." Robert grinned sheepishly. "Yeah, I'm not really good with guns." They talked while Jennifer held the towel against Jack's neck. He told them how he had come to be there, leaving out some of the more painful parts of his story. "What about you two?" "We're cousins. Jen lived with me and my mom." He looked like he might cry, but then held it together. Jack noticed a tear in Jennifer's eye. "She died the day after Christmas. We lived in Greenhaven." Jack had heard of Greenhaven. The suburb wasn't much of a drive from his own. By the time they'd talked about the invasion and the things they'd experienced, Jack's wound had stopped bleeding. "I think it started to clot. We should bandage you up," said Jen. Jack nodded, then tensed. "Wait, what time is it?" "Maybe 11 a.m., answered Robert. "Why?" Jack relaxed, then looked at him with fierce eyes. "Because we have to set a trap." "What?" Jack climbed to his feet, keeping the towel over his neck. "A trap for the rest of the camp soldiers when they come back." Robert raised his eyebrow. He hadn't really thought ahead, but taking on the guards was not at all on his radar. In fact, now that they were talking about plans, he thought the best course of action would be to take Jen and get away clean. "No, I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should escape now." "What?" Jack's face was incredulous. "Well, it's just that we should run now while we have the chance." "We can't, Robert," said Jen. "It wouldn't be fair to the other kids. Who knows what would happen to them after all this?" "Jen, we've talked about this, about Texas." "Yeah, but that was before Jack came in and went all Terminator." Jack smiled, not displeased at the reference. "What about Texas?" he asked. "Not yet," said Jen. "We'll tell you while I'm patching you up." Robert dragged the dead naked soldier behind the desk before Jen went in and located a first aid kit in the commandant's office. She had Jack sit on the desk while she stood and tended to his wound. "So, what about Texas?" asked Jack, wincing as the girl dabbed alcohol swabs on his neck. "We heard the commandant talking on her phone," said Robert, not sure why she was speaking in English or who she was speaking to. "But I heard something about rebels in Texas, north of Houston. We had an idea that if we escaped, we would head there." "Dude, you know that's like 2,000 miles, right?" "I'm not an idiot," he said. "I worked out it would take us like 2 months." "Yep, through deserts and shit. There's no way." Robert looked at the floor, his face dark. "What about a plane or a helicopter?" said Jen as she stuck a large adhesive patch over Jack's bullet graze. As they continued their discussion, she also tended to the shallow stab wounds he'd suffered in the struggle with the female perimeter guard, sterilizing and then taping them. Robert guffawed. You going to fly it then, Jen? His cousin reddened, but Jack looked thoughtful. You know what? That's not a bad idea. Oh, right, said Robert, standing up and throwing his arms in the air. I suppose you have a pilot's license now? Jack laughed. No, but I remember near the zoo, there's an airport that a company used to run joy flights to Sacramento from. We took my grandparents there. We'd need a pilot, though. Probably have to kidnap one. Once this mess is found, said Jen, won't they be on high alert? Good point. He thought on it a bit longer. We'd be better to steal one of the vehicles and travel as far by road as we could before trying. Why not forgo the whole kidnapping helicopter thing and go the whole way in a vehicle then? Asked Robert, reasonably. I don't think we'd make it all the way, said Jack. He wasn't sure why he'd been so easily convinced to go to Texas. But Robert was right. Kidnapping a pilot and stealing a helicopter seemed ridiculous when he heard it put that way. I guess we could start out that way and see what happens. Robert nodded, happy that Jack had finally given one of his ideas some merit. We'll need to dress in Chinese uniforms if we're going to make it further than a block. See if you can find some clean ones while I gather up some weapons. So we'll leave as soon as we're ready? Asked Robert. No, after I show you how to use an automatic and we ambush the guards. Here's what we'll do. 38. As the buses turned into the school parking lot, Lieutenant Zhu Wang, his assault rifle hanging over his shoulder, headed to the front of the bus, gripping seatbacks for balance as he went. Oblivious to the children in his charge, he was dying for a cigarette and hoped to get a few puffs in before Iron Pants Chew came out. The first through the door, he yelled at the children to stay put before jumping out. Chen and Lu followed him off, and the driver stayed in his seat with the engine running. The other bus pulled up behind, and the two soldiers on that bus joined their three comrades. Wang offered his girlfriend and fellow lieutenant, the very lovely Eva Howe, a cigarette. She looked nervously at the front door of the office building. Come on, Wang insisted. Iron Pants has been taking her own sweet time lately. Probably in there poking Vincent again. The men laughed. Eva Howe just shook her head. I'll just have a puff of yours. Wang handed over his Camel and watched rapt as her pretty lips closed over it. The look in her eyes was anything but innocent as she took a deep drag and touched her tongue on the butt before handing it back. Wang felt his manhood twitch in response. God, he loved this girl. Where the f*** are the home guards? Said Chen, his chubby face annoyed. I need a piss. His attention diverted from Eva, Wang looked back at the building. It was unusual for the guards to take this long to come out and take charge of the brats. Maybe old Iron Pants is having a party. This drew snickers from his comrades. Come on, Chen, we'll put a rocket up their asses. Wang handed Eva his smoke and raised his eyebrow cockily before heading for the closed door. Smiling, she shook her head and took a final drag before dropping it to the ground and stamping it out. She had barely looked back up when gunfire shattered the quiet afternoon. Eva saw a tall man firing from behind a dumpster in front of the first bus. Zhu, Wang, and Chen didn't stand a chance. They jerked crazily as the bullets tore into their backs. Eva screamed in horror and took a shocked step towards the broken body of her beloved as the soldiers around her began pulling their guns and firing. The shooter disappeared back behind the dumpster. Gunfire erupted from a window above her and mowed down the soldier beside her. Eva ducked, glancing up and recognizing the kitchen boy immediately. What the... More gunfire sounded near the buses, but Eva was preoccupied with the kitchen boy who had just aimed the muzzle of his gun at her. She turned and ran, unslinging her gun as she raced for the door of the second bus. They needed to get out of the school grounds until she knew what they were facing. She flinched as a burst of fire from the front of the first bus took down the last of her comrades. She ran on, waiting for bullets to rip into her. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10 feet. The bus door closed. No! The bus began to reverse, but a short burst of gunfire peppered the windshield with bullet holes. The driver slumped over his steering wheel and the bus's backward motion began to slow. Eva skidded to a halt and looked frantically for cover. "Drop your weapon," yelled someone in English. She was distracted by movement from the building's entrance. The door was pulled open and the kitchen boy, Robert, stepped out, aiming his gun at her again. Done running, she turned her assault rifle toward him, her finger poised over the trigger. Two things happened to stop her. The rolling bus banged into a low brick wall to her right, and a voice, now very close behind her, shouted, "Drop it!" 39. Eva put one hand in the air as she bent over and put her weapon on the pavement with the other. She saw the female kitchen hand bob up in the window her kitchen maid had fired from, then disappear just as quickly. The man behind her stepped around her, his weapon trained on her, except he wasn't a man. He was a boy. The same boy who had shot her love in the back. There was blood all over him, and he had a bandage on his neck. Clearly he'd been through a fight. He kicked her weapon away and then patted her down. Over his shoulder, she saw kids pouring out of the first bus and realized that driver had also been incapacitated. The cook arrived, and the other boy ordered him to watch over her. "Everybody out!" Jack yelled. The doors of the second bus hissed open and excited kids piled out. Jack herded them close to the other bus, almost overwhelmed by their questions. Jen emerged from the admin building and ran over to join him. "Everyone quiet. I'll answer all your questions, I promise. For now, go back to your barracks and rest. We'll bring you food and water soon." There was some argument at this, but a tall boy took charge and, along with Jen, led them back to the barracks without further drama. "Inside," ordered Jack when he returned. They led her inside and tied her wrists behind her back with a zip tie before sitting her down on a chair in the foyer. She avoided looking at her dead commander. "Are you sure it was a good idea not to kill her?" Robert asked. "Yes, if we're going to make it to Texas, it will be valuable to have a hostage, especially one who can speak Mandarin." "I don't know." "Texas? You stupid kids won't make it to the next suburb," spat the prisoner. "Oh, good, you speak English," said Jack. "You may be right. Maybe we won't. But we haven't got anything to lose." "Well, I'm not helping you." Robert looked at him with an I-told-you-so face. "Well, if you don't want to end up like her," he said, pointing to the dead commandant, "you will." This time Eva did look. While she had no great fondness for Senior Field Officer Chu, or what they were doing to the American children, the sight of Chu's dead and staring eyes brought tears to her eyes. Not for Chu, though. "I promise you, Chu, I will kill this boy for what he did to you." Aware only of the sadness on her face, Jack's expression softened. "Look, I won't kill you, and if you come with us quietly, we'll let you go when it's safe to do so." She closed her eyes as if she didn't want to hear his voice. Jack shrugged and secured her to the chair by tying a rope around her waist and then under the seat. If she tried to get up, she wouldn't make it far. "Okay, we need to get these kids fed," he said to Robert and Jen. "I want to be on our way by nightfall." Jack had taken a handful of ibuprofens to ease the pain in his ear and neck, and rested while Robert and Jennifer dished up what would be their last such meal to the captive children. He thought back, sometimes with disbelief, over the events of the day. While he hadn't come out unscathed, his solitary assault on the undermanned compound had worked out far better than he could have dreamed. Then, after his crash course on handling and firing the assault rifle, Robert had ably assisted him and finished the job. He knew he wouldn't have been able to do it alone. Now, including his earlier kills in the day, 14 of the enemy were dead and 1 was a prisoner. There were no wounded or dead amongst the kids. Given that he'd half expected Robert might accidentally shoot himself, it was a miracle. The plan now was to take the prisoner with Robert and Jen when he left. He didn't really know how that would pan out. Robert still seemed to view him with some resentment, even though Jen had accepted him, and taking a prisoner would present its own issues. He started to second-guess himself. Maybe it would be better to just leave and go back to his original plan of hiding out in the El Dorado forest. Of course, that would mean shooting the prisoner, as there would be no need to take her. Almost as if she sensed his doubts, Jen came over with a steaming bowl of noodles. Thanks. Jack hadn't realized how hungry he was until he smelled the delicious food and began to wolf it down despite its heat. Wow, this is good. I've been eating cold soup out of a tin. She crinkled her nose as she sat down next to him. You deserve a treat for saving our asses. He waved away the compliment. You guys did your fair share. Robert did, but only because you trained him how to fire those guns. He noticed she was holding her hand awkwardly. What's wrong? She showed him her wrist, which had a livid red mark on it. Burnt myself on the cooker. Jack winced. You should bathe it in cold water. I did, don't worry. I put some ointment I found in the first aid kit on it, too. Good thinking, said Jack, attacking his noodles again. You're still taking us with you, right? He paused, perhaps a little too long. Please, we won't be any trouble, and don't you think we have more chance if we stick together? Jack didn't think that at all. He was pretty sure he could sneak back to the El Dorado forest and live alone and quite comfortably for a long time. Still, he had vowed he wouldn't do that. Maybe his best chance of taking further revenge on the invaders was to head to Texas and join with a larger force. The thought of being with other people for a while also appealed to him. The singular quest for revenge didn't seem quite so urgent with others to worry about. Sure, I'm not going anywhere without you guys. Besides, Robert needs more shooting practice. The pretty 13-year-old laughed and stood up. Well, great. I'll just help Robert finish up. Then we can get loaded up. Jack watched her go, suddenly feeling a weight of responsibility that he hadn't felt since his sister had died. Was that a good thing? Time would tell. 40. They loaded up the Chinese Humvee with an assault rifle each, along with one spare and enough ammo to start a war. Jack also took the pistol and of course still had his knife. They let the other children take the rest of the guns and ammo that Jack had stacked in the school entrance. While they worked, a couple of the older kids, 2 girls and a guy his age and 1 boy a year younger, had taken charge of the remaining children and started working on their own exit strategy. Jack told them about the El Dorado forest and pointed it out on a map they found hanging in the commandant's office. They all agreed it seemed like a good place to get lost. While Robert and Jen were inside picking up last-minute supplies, the 4 older teens piled all the kids onto the bus with the undamaged windshield. He had shot the first driver through the side window, and it had been easy enough to kick the remains of the glass out so the damage would only be evident on close inspection. Jack looked in at the kids when they'd finished loading. Some were on the floor and squashed 3 to a seat. It would be an uncomfortable ride for them, but nothing worse than the hardship they'd been through since the invasion. "Who wants these?" he asked, holding out the keys to the vehicle he'd driven from the forest. The oldest girl, she was tall with an interesting rather than pretty face, put her hand out and he dropped them into her palm, and he gave them directions where to find it. "If you travel with the Chinese vehicle in front, you'll raise less suspicion. With a bit of luck, you might even make it without getting stopped. What will you do if you are stopped?" "Pray and shoot," said the girl with a crooked smile. "Not necessarily in that order." Jack smiled, thinking if he'd met her in another setting, they might have become fast friends. "Okay, good luck. You too." A few minutes and a lot of bunny hops later, the bus, driven by the oldest boy, made a wide circle and jerked its way out of the school. He saw the girl with the interesting face at the driver's shoulder yelling instructions. Despite the circumstances and the fact that those kids faced an uncertain future, he couldn't help but smile. Within the hour, as the last of the sun was fading from the sky, they loaded the prisoner into the back seat of one of the 3 Army vehicles in the lot. It was identical to the one he'd been driving, but with a full tank of fuel. Robert, now wearing a Chinese uniform as well, slipped in beside her and Jack handed him the pistol, making a point to show him and the prisoner that the safety was off. "Keep that on her. If she moves, shoot her in the head." Robert nodded. Jack didn't think she'd be any trouble. Not yet, at least. In fact, the woman looked thoroughly depressed, which he supposed in the circumstances was understandable. Jen climbed into the front passenger seat and put on her seatbelt. She also wore a uniform that was about 3 sizes too big for her. "All set?" he asked them. There was an enthusiastic yes from each of the cousins and a sullen face from their prisoner. Jack started the engine and headed out of the school. 41. They had passed by the airport soon after leaving the school and found it was alive with light and movement. It became evident that the Chinese had set up base and were operating out of there. On the road, they saw several vehicles like theirs, plus larger troop carriers. They drew no attention to themselves, but Jack was on edge until they passed by Elk Grove on the 99 20 minutes later. Given that nearly every movie he'd seen about a post-apocalyptic event always had choked highways showing people trying to escape the city, he was surprised they didn't pass more abandoned cars than they did on the arterial road. "You wouldn't think anything was wrong if you just woke up today and went for a ride," said Robert. "Yeah, I guess the sickness can find people to their homes pretty quick." Jack knew this for a fact, and felt a pang of sadness as his thoughts went to his own parents' quick submission to the disease. "It did," said Jen in a soft voice. "Grandma got sick Christmas night and was dead by morning." Jack glanced at her and saw her eyes shiny with tears. He reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm going to switch on the headlights," he said, hoping to distract her. "Do you think that's a good idea?" said Robert over Jack's shoulder. "I do. I figure any army vehicle with lights on driving boldly down the highway will raise less suspicion than one with the lights off." "Fair call." "We'll drive until we get to Fresno. Then we'll find a side street to sleep for the night. It will be about 2 hours, I think. No traffic." "I need to pee," said the prisoner 10 minutes later. Jack rolled his eyes. "No, not yet." "Please, I'm serious. I will wet myself if I don't go." 20 minutes. If you can't hold on until then too bad." Jack supposed he could have pulled over to let her go when she asked, but it seemed too much like he would be letting her call the shots if he gave in to the demand so easily. True to his word, though, he pulled over when they passed Stockton on a flat piece of road between towns. He wasn't too bothered she would run. It was pretty much cleared land in every direction. They would easily catch her. Jack, Robert, and Jen all got out, too. Jack opened the door for the prisoner. "Don't try anything, okay? There's a bush over there." She nodded and swung her legs out of the car and stood up, stretching the kinks out of her back before looking up at him. "Well, hurry up." She turned her back to him, bent over, and waggled her fingers. "Are you going to pull my pants down for me?" "Oh," Jack mumbled, his face reddening. He was rescued when Jen stepped forward. "I'll help you," she said, taking the woman's upper arm. "Be careful," said Robert. "Call out if she tries anything." Jen waved, then marched the woman away from the vehicle and disappeared behind the bushes. Jack heard them speaking in the dead silence. Well, actually, he heard a lot of Jen's voice and some quieter answers he couldn't quite make out from the soldier. When they returned, Jen was smiling. "All done. This is Eva, by the way. Now we don't have to call her Hey You all the way to Texas." Jack laughed despite himself. The younger girl really had some sass. "Nice work. You two watch Eva while I go, then you can go, Robert." 5 minutes later, they were on their way. The occupants of the vehicle were quiet most of the way to Fresno. Jen tried some small talk with Eva after their apparent breakthrough, but the Chinese woman didn't seem quite so forthcoming with Jack and Robert in the car. Jack took a turn off the 99 into Fresno, and they drove for a few blocks, turning down roads and cross streets until they came to a stadium. The sign announced it to be Chukchansi Park, and Fresno Fire Department was right across the street. Unlike Sacramento, Fresno appeared to be completely abandoned. They had seen no one on the drive into town, and there was zero sign of the occupying forces. Even so, Jack thought it was better not to take chances by parking on the street, and when Jen pointed out the open gates in the fire department's parking lot, he drove straight in. He turned into the second row and rolled along until he found a space between 2 FFD-marked SUVs. It was plenty dark when he turned off the headlights. Jack and Robert broke into the fire station building and took turns going to the station house bathroom. Jen again took charge of Eva, nodding patiently at Robert's repeated warning to be careful. While the girls were in the bathroom, Jack and Robert broke into the vending machines. The candy machine gave up its contents more easily than the drink machine, but within 10 minutes they had a pile of candy and warm soda on a table in the station house dining room. Eva turned her nose up at everything but a Pepsi, which Jen held to her mouth so she could drink. But the rest of them weren't so fussy and hungrily ate chocolate, peanuts, and chips. "Oh my God, we'll be so high on sugar we won't be able to sleep," said Jen, sitting back in her chair and holding her stomach. "I don't think that'll be a problem," said Jack, yawning. "But yeah, we better try and have a more nutritious breakfast." Robert belched, belatedly putting a hand over his mouth. Eva looked away stonily into the distance. The other three looked at each other and cracked up in mirth when Jen pulled a face at the soldier's prudishness. "Should we sleep in here?" asked Jen. "No, I don't think so." Jack didn't really have a good reason for this, other than the vehicle felt safer somehow, not to mention they'd be primed for a quick getaway should anything happen. Jen insisted they tidy up, and after that they headed back out to the Hummer. Jack cut Eva's zip ties. She whispered a thank you as she rubbed the feeling back into them. He felt a little guilty at having pulled it so tight. It must have been hellishly uncomfortable to ride with them behind her back like that. "Sorry, I'll tie them in front for tonight, but any trouble and it'll be behind your back again." She nodded. He put a new tie on her wrists, in front this time and a little looser, then settled her back into her seat. This time he climbed in back next to her while Robert took the driver's seat. They locked the doors and settled into sleep. Jack wasn't worried about going to sleep with Eva next to him. He had the gun in his hands and was a light sleeper. He was confident if she made a move it would wake him. The thought had barely formed itself before he fell asleep. He wasn't sure how long it was before he awoke, but it was still dark and extremely cold in the car. He was busting to take a leak. He glanced at Eva. She was out of it, her head resting against the door, and both Robert and Jen were snoring the same soft snore in front. He smiled. Must be a family snore. As he sat there contemplating whether it was safe to leave them alone with Eva, a realization dawned on him. For the first time since Katie's death, he didn't feel alone, and his death wish had faded from the forefront of his mind. He really liked Jen. She was quirky and fearless, and now even her slightly neurotic and overprotective older cousin, Robert, was growing on him. The only dark cloud on his horizon was Eva and deciding what to do with her when the time came. That was something he could worry about in the days to come, though, and now he had two people to share the burden with. Unable to ignore his full bladder any longer, he opened the door and got out. He clasped his hands together and stretched his arms into the air to work the kinks out of his back. He was stunned when he felt something pressed hard against the back of his head. It was accompanied by a voice barely above a whisper that he caught in his good ear. "Oh, you in trouble now, boy." 42. Jack recognized the accent was American and that it almost certainly belonged to someone his age or younger. He opened his mouth to tell his assailant not to shoot when automatic gunfire shattered the silence of the night. Robert! His barrage was answered by the firework-like cracks of handguns being fired from the other side of the parking lot. Jack instinctively dropped, the gun of his assailant firing where his head had been a split second before. Before he hit the ground, he swiveled and swung his still-joined hands around, striking the side of his attacker's right leg just above the knee. He was rewarded with a grunt as the gun-wielder collapsed. Jack was on him immediately. He grabbed the kid's gun hand before he could turn it on him again, and they wrestled for control as the gunfight that had been initiated by Robert continued. Above Jack, a side window of the FFD SUV exploded, showering glass on them. He barely noticed. The kid under him was wiry and fighting hard. Jack's superior weight and strength began to tell, and he was able to slowly twist the barrel of the heavy pistol until it was under the kid's chin. His finger closed over the trigger finger of the boy's. The kid's eyes widened, not only at his predicament. It was only then he realized the kid had probably thought he was sneaking up on a Chinese soldier. The surprise turned to defiance quickly, the look on the kid's face almost daring him to pull the trigger. There was a hiatus in the automatic gunfire. "Stop firing, Robert!" Jack yelled. "Jack? We're under attack." Another volley of pistol shots whizzed overhead, and then a voice Jack didn't recognize called out, "Jimmy, where you at, man?" The kid under Jack twitched his head in that direction, and he knew right away it was Jimmy under him. "Jimmy, call out you're okay and to stop shooting," Jack grated. Jimmy looked like he might argue, but was convinced when Jack pushed the gun a little deeper into the soft flesh under his chin. "I won't hurt you." Jimmy weighed up his options and then nodded. "Hector, you can stop shooting. They're American." "Jimmy, is that you?" "Of course it's me." "You sure about this, man? Why they trying to drill us if they're American?" Jimmy rolled his eyes. "Because we ambushed them, you big dumbass. Quit shooting." Jack swallowed a nervous giggle he felt bubbling in response to the comical dialogue. He understood things were still balanced on a razor's edge. "Let go of the gun, and we'll stand up," Jack said. "I'm not going to shoot you." "How do I know that, man?" "Really?" The reality that he would have been dead already if the big white boy had wanted it cut through Jimmy's adrenaline-hyped brain, and he gave a short nod before relaxing his grip and allowing Jack to take it. "Okay, good. Come on." Jack got up and put out his hand. Jimmy ignored it and got up under his own steam. He teetered when he put weight on the leg Jack had struck, and this time allowed the bigger boy to steady him when Jack put out his forearm. Jack tucked the pistol into the back of his uniform pants. "Okay, tell your guys to come out, but with their guns down." "Hector, Donnie, all of you come out. Don't shoot or I'll kick your asses," called Jimmy, propping himself against the Chinese vehicle. The front door to the Hummer opened, and a blonde girl in a comically oversized Chinese Army uniform got out. "Hey, Jimmy," she said as if she'd known him for years, then looked up at Jack. We have a problem. Eva's gone." 43. As if he couldn't quite believe it, Jack leaned over and looked through the open door. The seat was empty. An unscathed Robert looked over his shoulder at him from the front seat. "She was there a few minutes ago, I swear." Jack stood up and slapped the roof of the Bangshi in frustration. He didn't have too much time to think about it as Jimmy's gang converged on them. "You'd better get out," Jack said to Robert, "and leave the gun on the seat." "Hi, I'm Jen," the girl said to each and every one of Jimmy's gang as they emerged from the dark. Jack shook his head at her perpetual friendliness. "I can't believe no one got hit," Robert said when they had assembled, and it was evident no one had been shot. "That's what happens when a bunch of kids have a shootout in the dark," Jen said, sagely. This time Jack also detected an element of contempt to her tone. "Did anyone see a Chinese girl get out of this truck?" Jack asked when all the introductions had been made. None of the ambushers had. "Jen?" "Sorry, I had my head between my knees when Robert started shooting everywhere." "Who is she?" Jimmy asked. "A soldier we took prisoner back in Sacramento. We need to find her. Her hands were tied, but she's made a run for it during all the excitement." Jimmy's eyes lit up at the prospect of hunting for an enemy soldier. "We can help. Let's find this bitch." "She isn't a bitch, actually," said Jen crankily. "She's pretty nice when you get to know her." "I hardly think taking her to the bathroom is getting to know her," said Robert. "She would cut our throats in a heartbeat." Jen opened her mouth to argue. "He's right, Jen. She can't be trusted. We have to find her before she raises the alarm." Within a few minutes, they had raided the station house for flashlights and began conducting a search for the missing prisoner. They scoured the parking lot, the street surrounding the fire station, and inside the stadium itself. An hour later, they reconvened in the parking lot. "No sign of her," said Jack. "Any of you?" Jimmy and his crew shook their heads. Jack nodded grimly. "That means she's on the run, and we'll keep going until she can alert her people. We have to get moving. Jimmy, you and your people should probably think about finding another part of Fresno to make your home." "No way, man. This is our territory. If those bitches come calling, we'll be giving them a true Serranos welcome." There was a chorus of agreement from his homies, and they bumped fists. "What if they bring tanks and helicopters?" said the ever-practical Jen. Jimmy shrugged, still looking tough. "We'll see what we see." "It's like 2 a.m. in the morning," said Robert to Jen and Jack. We should probably sleep before we drive again. After all we've survived so far, I'd prefer not to die in a car crash." Jack, who was tired and frustrated at having lost the prisoner, bit back a sarcastic response. He saw the sense to the suggestion. "In the car?" asked Jen. "No," Jimmy answered before anyone else. "You come back to our place and sleep in on a mattress. We'll even feed you breakfast. It's only a block away." Jack was reluctant, but saw from the looks on Robert and Jen's faces he would have a fight on his hands if he refused the gracious offer of the kid he'd so nearly killed, and been killed by, just an hour before. "Okay." As they walked out of the parking lot, none of them noticed the dark shape watching them from the rooftop of the firehouse. Lieutenant Eva Howe of the People's Liberation Army watched the American brats the whole time they searched for her. It had been easy to slip away when the idiot in the front seat began firing his weapon. Once she was safely away from the vehicle, she had quickly rid herself of the tie around her wrists by using the edge of the low brick wall to wear at the nylon until it snapped. Thank goodness the tall, dangerous one, the bastard who had killed her beloved, had decided to secure her hands in front. She would make him pay for his sloppiness. When they vacated the parking lot, Eva stood and slipped over the edge of the single-story rooftop, dropping to the ground silently. Part of her army training had incorporated Wing Chun, a martial art that favored skill and economy of movement over size and strength. She had taken to it like a baby to mother's milk, and its aspect of stealth would serve her well tonight. She padded silently after the Americans. "This is nice," said Jen. Her appraisal of the gang's hideout was generous in Jack's opinion. They were living in an old boxing gym, and the building stank like old sweat and liniment cream. It was spacious, though. From the door on the street, they had gone up one flight of stairs and through a door that opened into the massive room. There were 2 boxing rings on each side of the long space. In an open area near the far wall were weights and exercise equipment. The floor space down the center between the rings was covered with sleeping bags, air mattresses, and an assortment of blankets and pillows. A girl had been waiting for them when they arrived. Her name was Selma, and after Jimmy had briefed her on what had gone down, she asked a bunch of questions. "Oh, well, she's long gone now. Did you guys want something to eat or drink? We have plenty, as long as you like eating out of a can." "No thanks," said Jack. "We ate before we bedded down in the truck for the night." "Okay, well, you all looked beat. Did you want to pick a bed?" Jack took a quick look through the windows at the street outside as the others settled in to sleep. The light of the waning moon was enough to see that the street was as empty as he supposed much of the city was. God only knew how far Eva had gotten already. They would definitely have to make a move and get out of Fresno first thing in the morning. He laid down on the air mattress next to Robert and pulled the too short blanket up to his chin. It was as comfortable a bed as he'd had since sleeping on the sofa the last night at his family home. Someone extinguished the candle that was the only source of light in the cavernous room. In only a few minutes, Jack fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Eva had easily tracked the kids back to a dilapidated gray building a few blocks from the fire station. They were noisy and careless. 10 minutes after they entered the building, she sat down on the porch of the vacant store across the road and waited. The candlelight in the second-story window told her exactly where they were, and she waited patiently for a full hour after its light was extinguished before standing up and crossing the street. She bent over and pulled the short-bladed knife that had been secreted in her right boot the whole time before taking them off along with her Army-issue shirt. She folded the shirt neatly and placed it on top of the boots just inside the opening of an alley that ran down the side of the building. With the knife between her teeth and wearing only her socks, pants, and the black tank top that had been under her shirt, she followed the alley to the rusting fire escape. To anyone looking into the alley by the pale light of the quarter moon, they would have barely seen a shadow as she climbed the staircase silently. Within a minute she had climbed through a small window and landed softly on the worn timber floor beside a weight bench. Death in Socks had arrived at Joe's Gym and Fitness. 44. The first few died quickly. A scrawny boy first, then a girl. The boy had been lying on his stomach. She simply clamped one hand over his mouth and punched the knife between his C1 and C2 vertebrae, then pushed his face into the pillow until he stopped breathing. The girl, who was sleeping a little away from the rest, was messier. Again, she clamped her hand over the teenager's mouth, but this time punctured the carotid artery. The girl thrashed violently for the full minute it took her to bleed out. Eva hugged her tight the whole time, minimizing the noise of her struggle. 2 down, 7 to go. The next was another of the city kids who had attacked the vehicle, a boy again, this one bigger. He was sleeping on his back, his mouth and lips making a strange puffing sound instead of a snore. She hovered the point of the knife above his right eye, then violently hammered the base of the handle, driving the blade deep into his brain, killing him instantly. 3 down. She crept up to the 4th shape. This figure was smaller, and she recognized the blonde hair of the girl Jen instantly. She paused over her. A full 20 seconds passed before she decided to leave her for the moment. She told herself that it was in case things went awry and she needed a bargaining chip, but things had gone smoothly so far. She knew she was lying to herself. Was she getting soft? She stepped over the girl and found the next shape was the kitchen boy, Robert. Yes, this would be sweet. She knelt soundlessly beside him. He was also on his back, and she decided to kill him in the same efficient manner as the puffing boy. Eva raised the knife and hovered the point over his left eye. She was about to hammer it home when a piercing scream rent the silence. Jen was having a dream about her grandmother. She was sitting at the table of her kitchen, and Grandma was at the oven pulling out some freshly baked peanut cookies, her favorite. There was something not quite right, though. "They smell funny, Grandma," she said. "Don't be silly, dear," said Grandma without turning around. "But they don't—" Instead of that freshly baked cookies smell she knew so well, it was an acrid metallic smell. "Fine then," Grandma huffed uncharacteristically and stalked to the kitchen sink, throwing in the tray of cookies. Jen felt relief, until the sunlight streaming in the window darkened, that is. It was like someone had drawn a blind over the sun. Jen's eyes snapped open. The metallic smell of blood was strong, and when she turned her head, she saw a shape bending over Robert. She screamed. A sleep-addled Jack scrambled out of his sheets but was barely to his feet just as a dark shape sprang at him, knocking him back onto the floor. Metal glinted in the moonlight from the dirty windows, and he only just managed to raise his forearm and block the blade from slicing his throat. He grunted when it bit into his flesh. He reached for the knife hand of his attacker, but he grasped only air. The knife wielder eluded him and then firmly planted the short blade between his ribs. Jack gasped. He'd been stabbed. Jack closed his hand over the hand holding the knife, gripping it so it couldn't be withdrawn and used again. In the faint light, he locked eyes with his assailant. It was Eva, and her face shrieked fury. Eva was furious at herself for not killing the girl. Her sentimental mistake had seen the alarm raised. She heard the people around them shouting and scrambling for weapons. There was little time now. She stooped low over the boy Robert and looked quickly for her true target. Jack. She found him, a long shape scrambling from his sheets 3 feet away. She jumped clean over the stirring Robert and hit Jew's killer as hard as she could. He managed to block the first strike of her knife, but her second caught him in the chest just below his right breast. A few seconds more to finish him, and then she would gladly face her maker. Jack and Eva wrestled for control of the knife embedded in his chest as the waking children screamed and tried to work out what was happening. Jack felt blood trickling down his body as they struggled. The piercing pain in his chest was literally breathtaking, and he realized his lung had been pierced. Every time Eva tried to jerk the knife free, a new shot of agony traveled up and down his body as he felt his grip on consciousness slip. Both of their hands were slippery with his blood, and it was only a matter of seconds before she won control of the knife and finished him. An enormous bang accompanied the brief flash of a gun muzzle. Eva's head jerked violently to the right, and she was thrown off him to the floor where she lay unmoving. Jack heard a sob and looked up to find Jen, the heavy gun in her hand wobbling dangerously as she stared in horror at the woman she had just killed. Jack's world went dark. 45. Robert awoke to his cousin's high-pitched screams. He reached immediately for the automatic weapon he'd left on the floor next to his mattress and rose to his knees. "Jen, what is it?" "Oh my God, someone's attacking Jack! Help him!" Before he could even process that, another yell rang out, followed by swearing from the other kids. He heard grunting and struggling from Jack's bed. He turned his gun that way, and as his eyes adjusted to the faint light, he saw the silhouette of a woman kneeling over Jack. He raised his weapon, about to tell her to put her hands up, when Jen brushed by him and reached out. The gunshot in the enclosed space made his ears ring, and in the brief flash of the muzzle he saw Eva, for that's the only person it could be, collapse onto her side. His gun-shy cousin hadn't been reaching out. She'd been aiming a pistol. The harsh beam of a flashlight illuminated the horrific scene. Jack was on his back, a knife buried in his chest. The Chinese soldier Eva was on her side, a puddle of blood and flecks of gray forming a spreading halo around her head. Jen was standing on shaking legs, a heavy gun that he assumed belonged to someone in Jimmy's crew wobbling in her hand. Jack raised his head briefly, looking at Jen. Then it dropped back heavily to his pillow as he lost consciousness. Jen fell to her knees by Jack before the beam of the flashlight moved on, revealing the true extent of Eva's killing spree. "Robert, help me. We need a towel for the blood. Hurry." Robert looked around frantically as cries of anguish rang out from Jimmy and the other 2 survivors of his gang. He didn't find a towel, but whipped up what looked like a woven blanket similar to what they use in hospitals, and ran over to Jen with it. Jen was crying and looked to him for guidance. Should we pull it out or leave it in?" she asked. Robert inspected the site of the trauma. The knife protruded from about midway down his chest and to the right, almost directly under his pectoral muscle. He really had no idea what they should do, but felt leaving it in would only lead to other problems. "We'll pull it out. Here, let me. Get ready to compress the wound." Robert wiped the blood-slick handle of the knife with the blanket, then rested his left hand on Jack's chest and gripped the handle with the other. He eased it out slowly, and Jen immediately pressed the blanket against the leaking wound. Jack didn't flinch. He was out cold. Or worse. Jen must have considered this too, and still holding the blanket against the wound, reached up and felt for his pulse. "He's alive, but it's beating real fast. I'll hold it on. You should see if you can help the others." Dawn was breaking outside, and Robert was able to see more clearly. It was a bloodbath. Jimmy was bent over the girl Selma, holding her head off the floor. Robert realized that even though they hadn't been introduced as girlfriend and boyfriend, Jimmy obviously had feelings for her. His heart went out to the other boy. The other 2 survivors, the one called Hector and another slighter boy whose name he didn't know, stood around unsure how to react. "We should cover the dead with blankets," Robert said gently, and the boys gladly followed his suggestion. He went across to Jimmy and put his hand on the kid's shoulder. "Sorry for your loss, man." Jimmy nodded and wiped his nose with a bloody sleeve. "It's all right. It was quick, at least." He eased Selma's head to the floor and closed her eyes before leaning across and dragging her blanket over her face. He grabbed his flashlight and stood back up before turning it off. "How are your guys?" he asked Robert. "Jen is good, physically at least, but Jack got stabbed." "Show me," said Jimmy. "I seen plenty of stab wounds." They went back to where Jen was tending to Jack, and Jimmy, all business now, knelt next to her. "Let me, okay?" he said, putting his hand next to Jen's and grasping the blanket. Jen nodded and pulled her hand away. He gave her the flashlight and told her to shine it on the wound when he pulled the blanket up. The blanket stuck for a second, then came free, causing a small amount of blood to leak from the wound. "That's good. It's not bleeding too much now. It means it's clotting and that it didn't hit an artery or anything." Jimmy looked closely at the wound, then pushed a clean spot of the blanket against it. Still pressing the blanket down with one hand, he took the flashlight from Jen and looked around until he found the discarded knife. "Is this it?" he asked, holding it up. Robert nodded. "Oh, man, your boy is lucky. I think it punctured his lung, but it's too short to have done any deeper damage where it went in. My cousin got stabbed in nearly the same place with a longer knife, and they didn't even do surgery because the lung heals itself after a while. You got to keep the wound clean, though, and we need to wrap his whole chest real tight. We got a medical kit. I'll give you alcohol and stuff to look after it." "Are you sure?" asked Jen. "Well, I'm not a doctor, but if you know one's still alive, you're welcome to give him a try." With Jimmy's help, they dressed Jack's stab wound and then completed the more difficult task of wrapping a whole roll of bandaging around his chest. Jack didn't wake up, but moaned as they turned him from side to side to get it around and under him. "Shouldn't he have woken up?" Jimmy shrugged. They'd exhausted the depth of his medical know-how. "Maybe he's in shock. What are you guys going to do now? You're welcome to stay till your boy's better if you want." "Well, we want to help you clean up," said Jen, not really sure how to say bury your dead. "But we'll probably continue and head to Texas. I'm pretty sure Jack would want to stick to the plan. Right, Robert?" Robert wasn't convinced that moving Jack was the right thing to do, but he supposed that even though Eva didn't run for help, their original reason for getting on the road as quickly as possible, once the attack at the school was discovered, even Fresno wouldn't be far enough away if they began a big manhunt. Yeah, he would. They spent the next 2 hours transporting the dead to the baseball park in an old pickup truck Jimmy had found in week 1. Except for the freshly turned earth near where the pitcher's plate would be, the grass of the ballpark was lush and green. They lengthened the existing graves so that the 3 recently deceased could be laid to rest near their friends. Jimmy said a prayer over them when they were done. They wheeled Eva as far into the outfield as they could and buried her without ceremony. No prayer, no words, no looks back over their shoulders. "Better than she deserves," said Jimmy on the way out. They ate some breakfast mid-morning with Jimmy and his last 2 gang members, and then Robert went back and got the Mongshi and drove it back. It was a struggle getting Jack down the stairs, and he woke up once on the way down, his words unintelligible. "He's got a fever," said Jen, looking at Jimmy worriedly. "It's cool. It could be a bit of an infection. Just keep the wound clean and give him 3 of these with water every 4 hours. He handed her 2 packets of ibuprofen. "It'll keep his fever down till his body gets better." "Well, thanks for letting us stay and helping with Jack," said Robert, awkwardly shaking Jimmy's hand. "Not sure what we would have done without your advice." Jen came forward and hugged him. "I'm sorry we brought her here. If we hadn't, well..." Jen's voice hitched, the emotion of the morning finally catching up with her. She let out a sob. "It's okay, little lady," said Jimmy, hugging her back. "It's not your fault. It's nobody's fault but hers and the rest of them for killing our country. You be safe here." "You sure you won't come with us?" "Nah, this is our turf. We'll be okay." Jen wasn't convinced that Jimmy believed that at all. 46. When Jack drifted into consciousness, the earth was rumbling under him. No, not the earth. The floor. He opened his eyes. His vision was fuzzy, but he could make out sunlight low in his sight and something dark overhead. A roof? "Katie?" A hand grasped his, and he heard sounds like someone speaking, but couldn't make out words. He drifted into the blackness again. The next time he awoke, it was because the rumbling had stopped. He felt a cool breeze on his face and tried to sit up. The jab of pain in his chest immediately caused him to drop his head. "Don't try to sit up," said a girl. A hand took his. Katie? No, it's Jen. He drifted off again. The next time he awoke, the rumbling was back. He opened his eyes. His vision had cleared, and he saw he was looking at the ceiling of a vehicle. He craned his neck to look above him and saw a blonde head over the top of the seat back. Jen, he croaked. She looked over and immediately kneeled on the seat, putting her arms over and placing a cool hand on his head. Jack, you know me? Yeah, he said, puzzled at the question. Where are we? What's going on? Asked a voice from the front of the vehicle. He's awake, and he knows who I am this time, said Jen excitedly over her shoulder. Oh, good. I'll pull over soon. Jen looked back at Jack. We're in Arizona. Robert thinks we should be at the border of New Mexico in an hour. As Jack processed this, he placed his hands on his chest. His hands encountered tightly wound bandages, his fingers tracking lightly over the place he'd been stabbed. Now, fully awake, he realized he was in the cargo area of the Chinese Hummer. Against the wall to his left were 6 5-gallon jerry cans. Hector's dad was a mechanic. He had a tank of diesel and filled those up for us. Jen answered his unasked question. I'm so glad you're not dead. Jimmy said if you were going to die, it would take less than a day, but I was still worried. I'm glad, too. I mean, I'm not sure why I am, but I'll take it. Well, Jimmy's cousin got stabbed in the lung once. He said they didn't even operate because it hadn't done any other damage, and the lung would fix itself. So they just stitched him up. Robert did that for you, too. He used to do leather work at school, and then we just prayed. Jen clapped a hand over her mouth. Sorry, I'm babbling, aren't I? Jack smiled. It's okay. Thanks for saving me. A cloud passed briefly over her sunny features. You're welcome. I know you would have done the same for me. So I take it we're still headed for Houston? Yep, and Robert's trying to keep to the back roads. He says it's a big country and it will take years before they have enough boots on the ground to prevent all movement around the place. Robert's stock kept going up in Jack's estimation, and again he thanked his lucky stars he'd met them when he did. He was pretty sure he'd have been worm food back at the school if he hadn't. They stopped not long after he woke and ate some canned food washed down with warm soda. Jack thanked Robert for everything he'd done and praised how far he'd managed to get them so far. They briefly looked over the map, and Jack nodded approvingly at the route Robert had sketched out. It traveled on the major roads, but took alternative routes around any larger cities and would still probably be quicker than it would have been traveling directly with traffic back in the old days. By the time they climbed back in the Mongshi, Jack was exhausted. You should get more sleep, said Jen as Robert steered the truck headed back onto the hot asphalt of Route 40. Okay. Wake me when we get to Texas, he joked. Jack closed his eyes, worse for wear and lucky to be alive, but feeling happier than he had any time since America fell.